A candle that dripped without wax. An impossible clue only Holmes could read. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorne. Tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? Your voices make this journey extraordinary. Let's begin. It was in the damp chill of a March morning that the singular affair of the candle that dripped without wax first intruded upon our quiet at Baker Street. A heavy fog had settled across London, muffling the sound of wheels upon the cobblestones and lending to the day an atmosphere most conducive to melancholy reflection. Holmes, however, was as ever immune to the influence of weather, his mind sharp as a razor and bent upon the problem of a half-disassembled Stradivarius, which he was examining with that peculiar blend of tenderness and precision that marked his attitude toward his violin. I had been engaged in the perusal of the Times, noting the usual parade of politics, scandals, and reports of minor disturbances in Whitechapel, when our landlady ushered in a gentleman whose bearing at once arrested my attention. He was tall, spare to the point of gauntness, with an anxious pallor spread across his face. His dress was of excellent cut, though worn with a certain negligence that suggested his mind had not been upon his toilette. He clutched in one gloved hand a walking stick of dark oak, and in the other a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his voice low, with a tremor not entirely attributable to the cold. "My name, sir," replied Holmes, glancing up from his violin. "Pray, be seated. You will excuse me if I do not offer my hand, as yours is otherwise occupied. You are recently arrived from the West End, and no doubt have not broken your fast. Mrs. Hudson, tea, if you please." The gentleman started, and I observed the quick intake of breath so often provoked by Holmes's uncanny deductions. "You are correct," he said, seating himself with visible effort. "I have come from Bloomsbury. My name is Geoffrey Wenton, and I fear I bring to you a matter at once bizarre and perilous. Scotland Yard has dismissed me, my friends believe me unwell, but I assure you, sir, there is something deeply unnatural afoot." Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes half closed. "Proceed," went on and undid the parcel upon his lap, and revealed to us an object so commonplace that, at first glance, it appeared ludicrous that it should have been the source of such distress. It was a candle, unlit, of the sort found in any respectable household. Yet upon closer inspection I noted its singular peculiarity. Though its wick was charred, as if it had been used, there were no traces of melted wax upon its sides. Its surface was smooth and untouched, as though it had never burned, save for the blackened tip. "This," said Wenton, his voice dropping, "was discovered beside the body of my cousin, Lady Margaret Dorrington, late last evening." Holmes' eyes flickered open, keen and piercing. "The body?" "She was found lifeless in her boudoir, a look of the most dreadful terror upon her face. The candle sat upon the table by her side. It had clearly burned, yet there was no wax. None upon the floor, the table, nor upon the cloth beneath. The flame consumed it, but left no trace of its passage. The physician could give no cause of death. There was no mark upon her body, no wound, no sign of poison. Only that—" he gestured to the strange candle, and her expression. Holmes rose swiftly and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he took up his magnifying lens. With his customary precision, he turned the candle in his hands, his nostrils flaring as though to catch some faint scent. "Curious," he murmured, "most curious. You say this was the only object out of place?" "The only one. The windows and doors were fastened from within. No intruder could have entered. The servants were accounted for. And yet she lies dead, and this impossible candle burned without wax." Holmes's lips twitched in that faint smile which I knew signified the arousal of his keenest faculties. "Impossible, my dear Mr. went on. Nothing is impossible, only improbable. The task lies in narrowing the field of probability until truth emerges." Wenton's voice shook as he pressed on. "I implore you, Mr. Balmees, Come to Dorrington House. If you do not, I fear more misfortune will follow. There are whispers in the household, talk of curses, of spirits. Already the servants mutter of resignation. I am not a fanciful man, but I cannot explain what has transpired. Only you, sir, can shed light upon this dreadful business." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then set the candle gently upon the table. "Watson," he said, with that sudden briskness that invariably signalled the acceptance of a case, "we go to Bloomsbury." I confess I felt a thrill of both dread and anticipation. For though I had seen many strange things in Holmes's company, never before had I encountered a clue so apparently unnatural, so fraught with the suggestion of the uncanny. Yet if Holmes's calm demeanour was any guide, the mystery would yield to reason, as all things must when subjected to the scrutiny of his method. Within the hour we were in a hansom, rattling through the fog-bound streets of London toward the home of the late Lady Margaret Dorrington, and toward the first steps in what was to prove one of the most perplexing and sinister adventures of my long acquaintance with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The fog had not lifted by the time our cab drew up before Dorrington House. The lamps along the square burned as pale discs in the damp, and the visages of passers-by were blurred as if seen through ground glass. A constable stood at the gate with his cape beaded in moisture, and he gave us admission upon Wenton's word, though not without that official obstinacy which would bar even Providence itself from interfering with a case once the yard had put a foot across the threshold. Within, the hall was high and sombre, lined with portraits whose eyes glimmered faintly in the dim light. The air held that mixture of coal smoke and attar which clings to houses of fashion. A tremor seemed to run through the servants ranged in a nervous knot near the foot of the stairs, as though the very banisters carried whispers. "This way, Mr. Holmes," said Wenton, his voice subdued. "The room has been kept as it was." "Except for what the doctor disturbed," came a crisp tone from the upper landing, "and what we disturbed after him. Good morning to you, Mr. Holmes. Doctor." It was Inspector Lestrade, lean, alert, and wearing an air of proprietary scepticism which sat on him like a familiar coat. Though Holmes had crossed swords with that worthy on many an occasion, there existed between them a grudging respect which is the nearest approach to affection admitted by certain temperaments. "Lestrade," said Holmes pleasantly, "you are early at your devotions." "A lady of consequence is dead under peculiar circumstances," returned the inspector. "It is not for the yard to neglect the sanctuary of Bloomsbury. I am told there is also a candle, which, if I may be permitted a smile, drips without wax. If you can keep both the smile and the candle till I have seen them, we shall all be the wiser," said Holmes, and he mounted the stairs with that swift, noiseless step, which always gave me the impression of a greyhound slipping its leash. The boudoir of Lady Margaret was on the first floor at the back, a fair room with pale paper and long windows giving upon a strip of garden where even the shrubs looked chilled in the March fog. The curtains were drawn to, the fire had burned low to a red cave, and in that penumbral glow I saw at once the small rosewood table beside a chaise, and upon it the infamous candle. The shape of it was unremarkable, the base broad and sensible, the wick a little blackened nub. Beside it lay a saucer quite free of any telltale streak, and a handkerchief of fine lawn embroidered with the letter M. Holmes did not go first to the table. He stood just within the door and surveyed the whole with that comprehensiveness which was the essence of his method. "Do not stir the air," he murmured to me, and then he passed, light as a cat, to the windows. He put his finger to the upper sash and brought it away with a faint crescent of soot. Cold fog, yes, within as well as without. He examined the catches, peered at the screws, and ran a nail under the paint of the frame. No fresh abrasion. "The sill, Watson, stoop here. Do you observe anything?" I saw only the dull lead line where countless London rains had left their mark. Holmes bent close and took from his pocket a lens, then a small penknife with which he teased at a minute fibre lodged where the sash met the jamb. He lifted it and set it upon his cuff. It was a filament of some pale thread, no longer than the nail of my little finger. He said nothing, but placed it in an envelope which he marked with his rapid, precise hand. He next examined the door. The key was within, the bolt shot. He studied the plate and the socket with an attention that would have seemed absurd in any other man. "There has been a thread here also," he said at last, more to himself than to us. "Note the faint polish on the rim of the bolt, as from a thread drawn smartly and at a slight angle, afterwards snapped away." Yes, he made another small capture from the mortice, so slight that Lestrade, who had been watching with some impatience, could not restrain a shrug. "A dusting of lint, and we have a murderer, eh?" said the inspector. "Ah, Lestrade," Holmes answered amiably. "If the murderer be not made of lint also, we may have something yet." He now crossed to the table. The surface bore a shallow ring where some warm thing had stood. I saw it at once, though I cannot say whether my observation was my own or the reflection of Holmes's habit of seeing. He set 2 fingers within the ring and lifted them, then touched them to his tongue with the air of a man testing a sauce. "Not wax," he said, "not tallow. A ghost of a taste, spirits, and here—" He moved his lens over the linen cloth and smiled with his eyes. "A mere blister in the nap, as from heat more than a candle is wont to give." "The doctor says there was no burning," Wenton interposed, as though half apologizing for facts that contradicted each other. "No singeing of her gown, nothing of the kind." "Quite," said Holmes. "The flame need not kiss the flesh to frighten the soul." His fingers alighted upon the handkerchief, lifted it, and then set it down with a delicacy I had seen him use upon violin strings. "Her scent?" he asked. "Lady Margaret used violet water," said a woman's voice from the doorway. It belonged to the housekeeper, a rigid personage with a face like a well-kept ledger. "Always violet?" Holmes inclined his head. "And yet here is a whiff of something not violet, vervain perhaps, but faint, almost eclipsed by another emanation. Wintergreen? Number. Clove, yes, clove. And camphor, a ghost of it." He sniffed the air near the candle, and then, turning, took from his pocket the very object Wenton had brought to Baker Street. Placing our specimen and the one upon the table side by side, he looked from one to the other as a painter studies 2 tones of the same colour. "They are siblings but not twins," he mused. "Do you note the base? This one," he tapped the candle from the table, "has a slightly broader foot and a subtler bevel. The wick is of the same braid, but trimmed differently." He pressed his thumb softly against the side and frowned. "And the consistency is— well, we shall leave consistency for the present." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Lady Margaret, then," he said, nodding towards the chaise where the poor lady had lain and been removed. "Dr. Hornby says her heart ceased without visible cause. I don't fancy a candle frightened it into quiet." Holmes went to the chaise and stood looking down upon the cushion as if the indentation itself might speak. His face, though composed, had taken that withdrawn look I had seen when he traced a chain of ideas behind his eyes. He knelt and inspected the floor beneath, where a small library of books rested upon a tray. One lay half pulled from its fellows, a thin volume bound in grey paper with gilt lettering. He glanced at the title, A Key to the Spheres, 9 Evenings with the Unseen, and opened it at random. A pressed petal fell to the carpet, and with it a small scrap of blue paper scorched along one edge. He picked the scrap up in his forceps, read a fragment, "When the flame answers," and slipped it, too, into an envelope. "Spirits, Inspector," he said quietly. "Not the kind found at the club?" Wenton's hands gripped the back of a chair until the knuckles blanched. "She had lately fallen in with a coterie of persons who meet in the evenings," he stammered. "It is a fashion. They call it a circle. There is a woman, Madame Vale, who claims—" That the dead speak when given proper appointments and a suitable remuneration, Holmes finished, not unkindly. And what do the dead require more than the living? Candles, cabinets, and the management of a clever hand. There is more, Wenton said, lowering his voice as if the portraits might overhear. Lady Margaret had quarrelled with Sir Felix, her husband, over such meetings. He forbade them, she persisted. He left the house last night for his club and has not been seen since. Convenient, Lestrade observed. Or merely clubbable, said Holmes. We will not convict a man of murder for preferring beefsteak and gossip. He turned his attention to the mantel. Upon it stood a clock with a porcelain shepherdess each side, and behind the shepherdess a spray of paper spills for lighting. He counted them with his eye, then took up two and weighed them as if they were coins. Tell me, Mrs. Burford, at what hour did you last set this room to rights? Before dinner, sir. Her ladyship dined upstairs at 8. I had the hearth made up at 7:30. And this morning? We have not touched a thing. The inspector forbade it. Very proper. Holmes lifted the spill jar. A faint crescent of dust showed a space where something had lately lain. He measured the space with 2 fingers and seemed satisfied. You will observe, Watson, how the dust remembers what people forget. He next went upon his knees at the fender and delicately stirred the ash with a paper knife. A flake of char turned to show the imprint of a watermark, a coronet over a D, and with it a corner of heavier pasteboard, blackened, but legible enough. Admission, Wednesday, back row. He showed it to Wenton, who nodded miserably. The séance, he said. Wednesday last? Wednesday last, Holmes repeated, and his fingers moved like a conjurer's arranging an invisible sequence. A circle, a candle, a ring of unusual heat, a thread, a window that is shut and yet has given up a hair of linen to the jamb. A door that is bolted and yet bears the polish of a thread drawn through. And a lady who feared nothing more than to be made ridiculous. You think she was frightened to death by a trick? Lestrade demanded. I think the trick was devised for a purpose beyond laughter, Holmes returned. He stood again, and his eye fell upon the rug. Ha, Watson, your knees, if you please. He indicated the edge nearest the chaise. There, so small I should have trodden it into oblivion, lay a minute droplet like a pearl dried to chalk. He touched it, and it yielded, not greasy as waxwood, but brittle, crumbling to a faintly aromatic dust upon his finger. He smelt it, and his nostrils flared. There is our clove again, and with it a sharper spirit. Imagine, Lestrade, a flame that leaves no common trace because it feeds upon uncommon liquor. Spirits, you said. Spirits, he echoed, and his gaze returned, thoughtful, to the candle. He took from his pocket a pin and, with the delicacy of a surgeon, pricked the side just above the bevel. The pin entered and came away dry. He pricked again higher. This time there was the faintest tap, as if the steel had struck something less yielding than fat. He smiled without mirth. We will not mar our host's property further, he said, and set the pin away. From the corridor came the beat of steps and a man's voice raised in protest. The door opened on a breath of colder air, and a figure of fashion barred the threshold, a man of some 45 years with a well-kept moustache and the flush of a lover of late suppers. What is this impertinence? He cried, though his outrage was excessively rehearsed. My house is in mourning, and you pour it like a curiosity shop. Sir Felix Dorrington, I presume, said Holmes without ceremony. And you are the busybody my cousin dragged in, Sir Felix returned, his lip curling. His eyes, however, took in the room with a quickness not out of keeping with intelligence. They slid to the book upon the tray, to the handkerchief upon the table, and to the candle. At the last, something flinched in his expression. It was the smallest contraction, but Holmes saw it, and I saw Holmes see it. We shall not trespass on your grief more than is necessary to prevent a repetition of it, Holmes said, with a courtesy that had the edge of a blade. You were at your club, I think, at the time of your wife's death? at the Diogenes. The name spoke of a select quietude where conversation is discouraged, an odd asylum for a man of Sir Felix's temperament. I thought I dined, I read, I slept. Ask whom you please, we shall ask whom we must, Holmes replied. Meanwhile, Sir Felix, there is a lady, Madame Vale, whose acquaintance we should all be the better for making. Sir Felix's hand went to his breast as if to pluck at some hidden irritation. That woman, he said, and in the two words was a weight of dislike that rang true. If my wife had not opened our door to charlatans— He stopped and mastered himself. Do as you please. Only take your circus out of here. We are already on our way, said Holmes, as if the notion had been his own a moment earlier. He took up the envelope with the scorched scrap, the filament, and the crumb of aromatic dust, and put the twin candles back side by side. One thing more, Sir Felix? Who has access to your key cabinet? My valet, the butler, myself. Why? Because bolts and keys are sometimes loyal to more than one master, Holmes murmured. He swept the room once more with that final, comprehensive glance, and then to me, softly, We have had our introduction, Watson. Now for the early investigation. As we passed into the corridor, I felt that peculiar tightening in the breast which tells a man that he stands upon the threshold of something both intricate and perilous. The candle behind us seemed to watch with its blind, blackened eye, and though reason mocked the notion, I could not rid myself of the impression that we had left, not a room, but a snare, delicately baited and not yet sprung. Holmes's hand touched my sleeve. You observed, of course, he said, that our candle burned, yet left the wrong kind of memory. I observed a ring, I confessed, and a scent. Just so, he murmured. Let us go and ask a certain lady how to make a flame write a false alibi. The fog had thickened into a clammy curtain by the time we emerged once more into the street. Holmes drew his coat tightly about him and hailed a cab with the brisk gesture of one already intent upon his next move. Went on accompanied us as far as the pavement, but Holmes dismissed him with a promise. Remain at hand, sir. I may need you at short notice. Meanwhile, guard your nerves, for nerves are apt to mislead the senses. With that, he handed me into the hansom and gave the driver an address in Bloomsbury, which I recognized, from his earlier remark, as belonging to Madame Vale. I could not restrain my uneasiness. Holmes, you surely do not suppose this woman can have had a direct hand in Lady Margaret's death? Such persons thrive on imposture and credulity, but I cannot imagine them venturing into murder. Holmes leaned back, his eyes half closed, as the cab jolted through the dim streets. Imposture, Watson, is a versatile tool. Its limits are set only by the impostor's boldness. When an audience can be persuaded to believe in the voices of the dead, why not persuade them also to die of terror? A candle that drips without wax, a ring of unusual heat, a door bolted with no intruder within, all these are but stage properties. Yet someone has employed them in earnest. You believe the lady was frightened into her grave? I believe, said Holmes, that the mechanism of her death lies concealed within a contrivance more subtle than mere terror. Terror may be the instrument, but the hand that plays it does so for a purpose. The husband, the cousin, the household, each supplies a motive. What remains is to see who has tuned the instrument. We alighted presently before a tall, narrow house, its blinds drawn, though a faint glow betrayed occupation within. A brass plate bore the name Madame Vale. Holmes mounted the steps and knocked sharply. After a pause, the door was opened by a young maid of sullen aspect, who led us to a parlour hung with draperies of deep green and illuminated by shaded lamps. The air was heavy with incense, and upon a round table in the centre stood a cluster of candlesticks, each bearing a candle half burnt. Madame Vale entered with the theatrical air of one accustomed to command attention. She was a woman of indeterminate age, with dark hair arranged in a fashion a decade out of date, and eyes that seemed perpetually alight with calculation. Her dress was rich, though verging on the gaudy, and she carried herself with the self-assurance of one who has long traded on mysteries. "Gentlemen," she said, inclining her head with a sweep that threatened to upset the cascade of rings upon her fingers, "you come not for communion with the departed, I think, but for questions of the living. Pray be seated. I perceive I address Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes bowed, though without warmth. "And this is Dr. Watson. We should not intrude upon you at this hour, but for the melancholy fate of Lady Margaret Dorrington." Madame Vale clasped her hands and raised her eyes with an expression of exaggerated grief. Alas, poor lady! So sensitive, so attuned to the higher vibrations. It is ever thus. The veil parts, the spirit world beckons, and the frail heart of flesh cannot endure the strain. She died as she lived, on the threshold of the infinite. Holmes regarded her with that languid amusement which I well knew concealed his keenest scrutiny. "Indeed. You attribute her death to spiritual exhaustion?" "What else, sir?" She was warned. I told her the flame of the candle is but a channel. To gaze too long upon it is perilous. The ether claims its own. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "A peculiar candle, then? One, perhaps, that leaves no wax behind?" For the first time, I saw Madame Vale's composure falter. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly suppressed. "The flame is of the spirit," she said, recovering her tone. "It consumes without residue." "Most remarkable," Holmes murmured. "Yet I fear the physicists of the Royal Institution might raise objection. Tell me, Madame Eatle, where does one procure such marvels? They are prepared according to ancient formulae. The secret is not mine to divulge." Holmes rose abruptly and examined the candlesticks upon the table. He touched one of the candles and brought his finger away with the same infinitesimal crumb he had shown me at Dorrington House. He smelt it, smiled, and slipped it into his pocket. "Ancient formulae indeed," he said softly. "Sir," Madame Vale protested, "you trespass upon sacred instruments." "Sacred or profane," Holmes returned coolly, "they are fashioned by mortal hands. I think you will find, Watson, that our hostess employs a mixture of certain volatile oils with her wax, oils that leave a perfume of clove and camphor. A candle so prepared burns hotter than its size warrants, leaving little trace. An admirable device for effect upon a credulous audience. You dare to mock what you do not understand," Madame Vale cried, her voice rising. "You scoff at mysteries older than your science." Holmes fixed her with a gaze of icy clarity. "Madame, I understand far more than you suppose. I understand that Lady Margaret Dorrington attended your circle last Wednesday. I understand that she received from you certain tokens, a book perhaps, and a candle, such as these. And I understand that someone has employed those tokens, not in theatre, but in tragedy." The woman paled and clutched the back of a chair. For an instant her bravado seemed to desert her, but it returned in a rush of defiance. "If harm befell the lady, it was not by my hand. I conduct my circles for the enlightenment of those who seek." "I am no poisoner." "Poisoner?" Holmes repeated softly. "I did not say poison. But you leap to the word with alacrity. An interesting choice." At that moment the door opened, and a man entered without ceremony. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the sober attire of a professional man. His face was rugged, his brow furrowed by habitual sternness. He glanced at us with thinly veiled hostility. "Madame Vale," he said curtly, "you should not receive strangers at this hour." "My secretary, Mr. Latham," she explained quickly. "He protects me from the idle curious." Holmes inclined his head with mock civility. "We are not idle, Mr. Latham. Our curiosity is of the most active kind. You will forgive us if we trouble Madame further at another time. For the present we have learned enough." He turned, and with a gesture drew me after him. Once in the street, I could not contain my bewilderment. "Holmes, she as much as admitted to providing the candle. Surely she is guilty. Guilty of fraud, Watson, undoubtedly." But guilt of murder is another matter. Did you observe her reaction when I mentioned poison? A false medium may dissimulate at will, but her instinctive fear betrayed that she knows of substances more perilous than wax and wick. And did you mark her secretary, a most unpleasant fellow, with a grasp on the situation that seemed firmer than hers? I should not be surprised if Madame Vale is but the mask, and Latham the hand behind it. What then is our next step? Holmes raised his stick and tapped it lightly against the pavement, as though to punctuate his thought. To ascertain who profits by Lady Margaret's death. Her husband gains freedom from an unwelcome pursuit, yet his grief, or its semblance, was too fresh to be dismissed. Wenton inherits nothing so far as I know, but the presence of that secretary suggests another thread. We must examine Lady Margaret's affairs, her will, her correspondence, her debts. Somewhere in the weave lies the pattern. We returned to Baker Street, and Holmes spent the remainder of the evening at his chemical table. He subjected the crumb from Madame Vale's candle to a series of tests, producing vapours so acrid that I was driven to the far corner of the room. At last he straightened, a gleam of triumph in his eye. "As I suspected," he said. "A compound of stearin with volatile oils, chiefly clove and camphor, but with a trace of something more subtle, an alkaloid. Not in sufficient quantity to kill, but to affect the nerves. Imagine, Watson, a candle which, when burned in a closed room, fills the air with a vapour faintly intoxicating, suggestive, conducive to visions. Couple that with a skilled manipulator of the emotions, and you may induce terror, indeed. And you believe Lady Margaret succumbed to such vapours?" "I believe she was subjected to them, yes. But vapours alone do not stop the heart. No, there is something more. The thread upon the bolt, the scrap of scorched paper, all point to a contrivance designed to impress the senses and conceal the hand that moved it. We must return to Dorrington House at dawn. There is a detail I have yet to test." With that he flung himself upon the sofa and drew his dressing-gown about him, while I sat long into the night, haunted by the image of the smooth candle with its blackened wick, and by the thought that in its flame lay hidden the key to a mystery darker than any we had yet faced. The following morning dawned with that watery half-light peculiar to London after a night of fog. The air was heavy still, though the mist had thinned enough to reveal the outlines of hansoms and drays lumbering along Baker Street. Holmes was already astir when I descended, his lean figure bent over a collection of papers strewn across the breakfast table, with a cup of untouched coffee cooling at his elbow. He glanced up as I entered, his grey eyes bright and hard, as though sleep had been banished from him entirely. "Watson, I have secured from our friend Wenton a list of Lady Margaret's accounts and correspondence," he said, tapping the sheaf. "The good fellow was as eager as any drowning man to clutch at a rope, and he has provided us with several most instructive letters. Observe this. 1. From Madame Vale herself." He pushed a sheet toward me. It was penned in a hand ostentatiously sweeping, full of flourishes and underlinings. "The candle is the channel," it declared, "but only if burned in solitude. Guard the flame from prying eyes, for it answers only to the one who dares gaze without fear." "A suggestion carefully planted," Holmes observed. "It invites the subject to an experiment alone, where no witness might testify." The hand that supplied the instrument ensured its conditions of use. Another, Watson, this one from a moneylender in Holborn, pressing for immediate settlement of a debt of £200. Lady Margaret had pledged certain jewels, yet had failed to redeem them. "Then she was in difficulty?" I asked. Holmes's lip curved in that faint sardonic smile. "Difficulty, yes, but difficulty that makes one malleable. Consider further. She quarrelled with her husband, sought solace in the company of spiritualists, and was pressed for money, a perfect soil for manipulation. Now let us put aside conjecture and return to the scene. There is an experiment I wish to perform upon the very room itself. We shall breakfast quickly, for Lestrade will meet us there by arrangement." Within the hour we were once more at Dorrington House. The servants greeted us with that mingled suspicion and relief which marks households where tragedy has unsettled routine. Sir Felix was absent, said to be at his club again, though with a brevity of explanation that did not escape Holmes's notice. Lestrade was already on the landing, his arms folded, and his expression wearied by long vigil. "I trust you've come to the end of your mysteries, Mr. Holmes," he said. "For my part, I see little but a lady too fanciful for her own good, and a quack of a medium to egg her on." Holmes ignored the complaint and went directly to the boudoir. The curtains had been drawn back this time, admitting a grey light that lent the room a funereal air. The candle still stood upon the table, untouched since our last inspection. Holmes produced from his pocket a small vial and a length of cotton wick. He placed the wick into the candle and lit it, standing back as the flame took hold. A faint aroma, sharp and medicinal, began to permeate the air. "Do you perceive it, Watson?" he asked. "Indeed," I said. "It is the same scent I noted yesterday, clove, and something acrid besides." "Precisely. Now observe." He held a porcelain saucer close above the flame for several minutes, then withdrew it. A darkening, like a thin varnish, had appeared upon the surface. The vapour condenses as residue. It is not wax, but an oil. If inhaled in quantity, especially in a closed chamber, it might well act upon the nervous system. Add to that the excitement of a séance, the terror of the uncanny, and a heart already strained, and you have a formula for collapse. Lestrade sniffed the air with distaste. "You're telling me a candle choked her?" "I am telling you," Holmes replied, "that the candle was the agent of her death, though not the cause. It created the theatre in which the true act was played. But let us not leap to the finale. There remains the matter of the thread upon the bolt. Observe, he crossed to the door, withdrew from his pocket a length of silk thread, and tied it deftly about the bolt's handle. Stepping into the corridor, he gave a sharp tug. The bolt shot home with a click. He untied the thread and re-entered. You see? The door may be secured from without, giving the appearance of a locked chamber. Thus the stage is set for a mystery where none exists. Lestrade looked on, unimpressed. A conjurer's trick, but to what end? That, my dear Inspector, is what we shall presently learn. Lady Margaret's death must serve someone's purpose. She had debts, yet she also possessed jewels. Who now inherits her property? Who collects upon her misfortunes? Holmes's eyes glittered. The answer may lie in the person most anxious to appear absent. As he spoke, a sharp knock came upon the door, and Wenton entered, his face pale and drawn. He carried a folded paper in his hand. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice unsteady, "forgive the intrusion, but this has just been delivered." "It is from Sir Felix Holmes," unfolded the paper, and scanned it rapidly. A short, curt note lay within. "I will not submit to inquisitions in my own house. If you desire my answers, you may seek me at the Diogenes, Felix Dorrington." Holmes gave a soft laugh. "The Diogenes? My brother will be entertained to hear of such a guest. Watson, you recall the club's rules. No talk, no fuss, only silence. What better alibi than to sit in a chamber where no man is permitted to address another? Very well, we shall verify his claim. Lestrade, you may accompany us if you wish." Thus it was that within the hour we entered that most peculiar of institutions, the Diogenes Club. The vast reading room lay hushed as a cathedral, each member ensconced in his corner, with newspapers spread like altar cloths. At a table near the fire, Sir Felix himself sat in rigid stillness, his gaze fixed upon a journal, though I observed his eyes did not move upon the print. He glanced up as we entered, then quickly returned his eyes to the page. Holmes, with his customary boldness, walked straight to him and stood silently until Sir Felix looked up once more. "This is a violation," Sir Felix hissed under his breath, "of every custom of the place." "It is also," Holmes returned softly, "a violation of nature that your wife should die of fright in a locked room. One offence balances another. He handed Sir Felix the curt note he had written. "You expected us, it seems?" Sir Felix tore the note to fragments with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. "You will not make a spectacle of me?" "No," Holmes said, "but you have already made one of yourself. Your absence at the hour of her death was most convenient. Too convenient. We shall test it." He turned on his heel, leaving Sir Felix staring rigidly at the fire, and led us back to the street. "He is frightened," Holmes said in a low tone. "But not in the manner of a murderer detected? Rather, like a man whose secret is endangered by the wrong suspicion. There is something here, Watson, that does not fit. The husband resents his wife, yet his dislike of Madame Vale was genuine. He would have driven her from the house, not employed her tools. No, our quarry lies elsewhere. Then who? Holmes raised a finger. Patience. Tonight, Watson, we return to Dorrington House unobserved. The threads of this play are drawn tight about that boudoir. If I am not mistaken, the stage is not yet struck, and the player may return for a final act. Night fell early, as it does in London when the fog refuses to lift, and by 9 o'clock we were once more before Dorrington House with our collars turned up and our intentions masked in the austere respectability of evening dress. Holmes, who disliked needless conferences, had contrived with Lestrade a discreet arrangement. A constable would loiter at the end of the square to keep away the inquisitive, but no uniform would show itself near the door. Went-on had been sent home. Sir Felix, by his own announcement, was at the Diogenes. The housekeeper had been persuaded, without the minutest hint of our true object, that certain inventories must be checked in the morning, and that the boudoir must remain closed. Thus prepared, we were admitted by a footman whose eyes darted like those of a nervous rodent, and we slipped very softly into a small dressing-room that communicated with Lady Margaret's chamber by a door which could be opened from our side by the gentlest pressure of a spring. Holmes moved with the swift, trained economy of a surgeon at his table. In 5 silent minutes he had made his dispositions. A hair, taken from my brush, was laid like a gossamer across the threshold of the outer door. A pinch of light ash from the grate he sifted along the boards between the table and the chaise, and a square of thin paper which he produced from his pocket. "Nitrated," he breathed with a gleam. He slipped beneath the edge of the linen cloth so that the slightest draught would send its corner quivering. He drew from his case a narrow tube of glass and, with an artist's delicacy, introduced it into the bore of the candle's wick until I saw only the faintest glint vanish within. Last of all, he tied about the bolt a thread as fine as a spider's web, ran it round the hinge in a loop that would break at a touch, and let the loose end fall behind the skirting board, where his fingers could find it again in darkness. "You load a stage, Holmes," I whispered, when we had retreated to the dressing-room and made ourselves easy on 2 straight-backed chairs that had never before known such conspirators. "Are we to watch a performance, or to play in it?" "If fortune be with us," he returned, "we shall be the audience tonight, and the critics tomorrow. Hush now. Listen not only with your ears, but with your skin-time, which in the daylight trots like any decent nag, at night lies down, and will not stir for love or money." The house breathed, the old timbers settled with minute sighs, a coal tumbled in the grate below, and from the street came at long intervals the hollow clap of a hoof. My watch told me it was 9:45 when I first heard, distinct among those homely noises, a sound too careful to be accident, the faintest vibration through floorboards, as when weight is distributed by a foot that knows its stealth. Holmes's hand closed upon my sleeve. I could just make out, by the crack of our communicating door, the dim square of the boudoir gloom. The hair across the outer threshold, would it stir? A little breath of air grazed my cheek, then with a sigh like the exhalation of a very timid creature, the thread loop at the bolt parted, and the bolt shot home with scarce a click. Holmes's mouth in the darkness became the ghost of a smile. The door had been secured from without. There followed a narrow interval in which the intruder stood and let the room come to him. I could picture the practice of it, the count of silent heartbeats, the mapping of obstacles in memory, the reach of a hand to the table's edge. The ash Holmes had laid gave its soft, betraying whisper under a cautious step. Then a faint sniff in the air, as if the person tested the room's scent. After that, a very gentle scratch at the table's cloth, the whisper of linen displaced. The corner of the nitrated paper would tremble now. I felt, rather than saw, Holmes lean forward in anticipation. A timid flare sprang, very small and very white, and went out at once. The nitrated paper had answered even to that minute draught. The intruder froze. 1 heartbeat, 2. Then bolder, the soft tick of metal against glass, a vial uncapped. A breath later, the air brought me a thread of that familiar perfume, clove riding upon a drier, more perilous spirit. A match rasped, the candle took with a little eager tongue. The flame steadied, burned tall, and began to give out its subtle exhalation. Holmes's hand left my sleeve. I knew that he was counting. He counts at such moments, like a metronome in a musician's skull. When he had to, his satisfaction measured the intruder's object. He moved. We were through the communicating door without a sound, and the figure at the table, a man in a dark coat and soft boots, his hat brim pulled low, had just time to lift his head before the room, which had held its breath, took it again in the shape of Sherlock Holmes. "Gentlemen," said my companion, and there was in his quiet the steel of compulsion, "we will not complete the experiment tonight." The man sprang back. His right hand flashed to his breast and came away with something that glinted, no weapon of a gross sort, but a little polished instrument such as a watchmaker might use. He threw himself left towards the window, but Holmes had anticipated the feint. He slipped between the man and that exit with the airy certainty of a dancer, and I, who had no such grace but some weight, placed myself squarely before the door. The fellow, finding himself trapped, made a desperate rush for the chaise. His boot struck the ash and left upon the carpet the neat half-imprint of a sole, with a curious triangular patch worn at the outer edge, a blemish any bootmaker could swear to. He flung himself low, groping beneath the chaise cushion where Lady Margaret's poor head had lain. His fingers came up with a dark shape the size of a snuff-box. Holmes's cane descended with a swiftness that astonished me, and the little box flew, struck the fender, and burst. A small bladder within collapsed with a faint wheeze, and I caught a breath of something that seared the nose and stung the eyes, camphor again, but sharpened with a medical extraction I knew from the surgery as a stimulant in concentrated form. The fellow reeled, not from the vapour, but from the knowledge that his device lay exposed. "Mr. Latham," Holmes observed, as if greeting an acquaintance in a drawing-room, "your courtesy does you credit. You come to air the room for us." The man's hat had fallen back. I knew him then for Madame Vale's secretary. The stern lines of his face were twisted now by something like hatred restrained. He gathered himself for a second rush. Holmes's long arm shot out and had him by the wrist. The little instrument, no more than a wire probe with a hooked end, fell and rang upon the hearth. "Gently," Holmes said. "You will not better your case by adding assault to burglary." "Watson?" The lamp I brought, the shaded lamp from the mantel, and in its restrained glow Latham stood, revealed, dust upon his knees, a torn glove upon the right hand, and, on the left, a smear no larger than a fingernail of something dark upon the palm. Holmes saw it, and his eyes flashed. "You have been busy with oils and pastes, Mr. Latham, permit me." He took the man's left hand in a grip that brooked no argument, touched the smear with a glass rod, lifted the faintest quantity and brought it to his nose. "Wintergreen to mask, clove to persuade, and, an alkaloid, very sparing, very prudent, enough to quicken the heart, not enough to silence it. You mix your theatre with a physician's caution. Where did you study, sir?" "Not at the hospitals. The street teaches cheaper tricks. Latham's reply, when it came, was as controlled as the rest of him. "You have no right," he said. "This is Sir Felix's house." "He sent for me." Holmes's brows rose. "An ingenious defence, and like your mixtures of delicate composition, alas, it lacks a binding agent. Sir Felix is, as we speak, under the eye of persons who will swear to his presence elsewhere. No, if you are here, you come on your own errand. The box under the cushion, your own contrivance. A bladder charged with your aromatic vapours, to be compressed by the hand at a telling moment, the candle to thicken the air and fix the mind, the thread to bolt the door, and this," he held up the hooked probe with a cold relish, "to fish away what, precisely, from some cranny a less experienced eye would not suspect?" A small change passed over Latham's face. It was not guilt, but calculation. He had measured our strength, measured the room, and found no gap. When he spoke, it was with a shift of ground. "You will ruin an innocent woman," he said. "Madame Vale knows nothing of this. If I am here, it is to prevent a scandal that would sink her. Lady Margaret, God rest her, was a client. Such people leave traces, papers, tokens. The curious would make filth of them. I came to remove what the gossips should not have." Truly, Holmes returned, and with what implement does one remove scandal from beneath a chaise? A surgeon's hook? Spare us, Mr. Latham. The scandal you fear sits not in papers, but in your purse. Lady Margaret had debts. Someone advanced to her. Who? Not the moneylender in Holborn alone. His letter is too blunt for your fine hand. Who else? The mask stirred again. You will find no promissory note here. Because you came for it, Holmes said very softly. He went to the table, extinguished the candle with a breath, and, taking up the pin he had used the previous day, pressed again at the bevel just above the base. This time, prepared and pitiless, he worked the pin around with a jeweller's patience. The side of the candle yielded by a degree. A seam, invisible before, disclosed itself as a mere change in the sheen. With a deft twist of the probe he had taken from Latham, Holmes separated the outer layer with the neatness of a glove turned back from a wrist. Within, not 2 inches above the base, lay a narrow cavity, and in it a roll of paper bound by a single silk hair. Holmes did not look at Latham as he lifted it. He unrolled it upon the table and smoothed it with 2 fingers. I saw characters I knew by weary repetition from my patient's signatures, the cramped haste of a woman uneasy. The sum, the date, the name of the creditor, all were there, and at the foot, in a hand I recognized from the curt note at the Diogenes, was the counter-signature of Sir Felix Dorrington. "You insured your loan," Holmes said, and the contempt in his voice was the rarer for being wholly devoid of heat. "Madame Vale supplies the stage, you, sir, the rigging. You advance money in her shadow to those whom her performances have made, shall we say, impressionable. You take in return signatures and pledges, and when a lady dies with debts upon her, you come back to tidy the ledger before the law can balance it." Latham's composure cracked at last. "I did not kill her," he said, with a sudden, savage earnestness that for the first time struck me as the ring of truth. "By God, I did not. I set a scene. I do not end lives. She frightened herself beyond my reckoning. I would have stopped it if I had been there." Holmes's gaze, which had flayed the man, grew thoughtful. "There," he repeated, as if turning the word in his mouth to taste its weight. "But you were not there. Who, then, turned your theatre to tragedy? Not Madame Vale, she is the curtain, not the hand. Not Sir Felix, his repugnance for your trade is too healthy to be feigned at such cost. Who else has both knowledge of the trick and access to this room?" Latham's lips thinned. "Ask your noble master of the house," he said. "His valet has more keys than scruples, and his butler keeps a steadier nerve than any undertaker. I tell you nothing further. You have told me enough." Holmes stepped back. "Watson, summon the constable." We shall deliver our guest to Inspector Lestrade with this." He tapped the rolled paper. "And the instrument and the box from under the cushion. He will find in them more nourishment than his palate commonly admits." I went to the landing and whistled softly. The constable came at a trot, and within minutes the whole practical machinery of consequence began to turn. Lestrade arrived in a gust of official indignation and efficiency, took in the room in one sweep, and clapped irons upon Latham with a relish that showed the world was restored to his liking. The secretary went between them without another word, his face grim in a way that suggested a man who chooses, when he must, the cell over the confession. When they had gone, Holmes stood alone in the room and let his eyes travel slowly from the table to the chaise and back again. He was not triumphant. He was listening inward, his mind, as I have said, sometimes like a room in which another man paces. At length he spoke, half to me and half to the air. "We have taken the stage manager," he said, "but the author remains. There is a hand that took Latham's toy and made of it a weapon. It is a hand comfortable with silence and threads and rooms that lock themselves. We shall not find it in Madame Vale's parlour, nor at the Diogenes, but nearer, much nearer." "You suspect one of the household," I said. "I suspect," he returned, with that cold clarity that makes even a suspicion feel like a verdict, "the person who knew most, surely when she would be alone, and who could step into this room without stirring gossip. There is a second candle to be found, Watson, and with it a second thread. We will pull until something gives Holmes's declaration hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot." I felt the same tightening in my chest that I had known on campaign, when the enemy was unseen but near at hand. The boudoir, dim in its morning light, seemed no longer the stage of a completed tragedy, but the half-dismantled set of a drama still unfolding. Holmes stooped once more to the table, tapped it lightly with his knuckle, and straightened with that sudden energy which told me his thoughts had crystallized. "We must see the servants," he said, "not in the glare of officialdom, but each alone in the natural order of their duties. One of them knows where the second candle is hidden." The housekeeper, Mrs. Burford, entered presently at his request, her expression still set in the iron mould of respectability. Holmes's questions were courteous, almost casual. At what hours she had last attended Lady Margaret, which of the staff had the liberty of entering this room, what changes had lately been made in the household routine. Her replies were prompt, unhesitating. The chambermaids dusted, the valet carried messages, the butler saw to her ladyship's wine. The doors were locked at night, she said, by her own hand. But when Holmes asked if Lady Margaret had ever admitted visitors privately in the evenings, Mrs. Burford's eyes shifted just once toward the carpet. She would receive her cousin, Mr. Wenton, the housekeeper admitted at last, and occasionally, though the master forbade it, those ladies of Madame Vale's circle, but no servant of the house, sir. I should have put a stop to it. Holmes gave a little bow that was both acknowledgment and dismissal. "Your diligence does you credit. One final matter. Where is the linen closet kept?" "On the upper landing, next to the butler's pantry." We left her to her indignation and mounted the stairs. Holmes examined the closet with a quick, predatory attention, running his fingers along the shelves, pulling open a drawer of spare candles. They were of the ordinary kind, dull wax, some half-used, none tampered with. He shook his head impatiently. "No, our phantom has more cunning than to leave the twin here." As we turned into the corridor, a figure emerged from the butler's pantry itself, a man of 50, with a square jaw and eyes as smooth as wet pebbles. He carried a ledger under one arm and inclined his head without warmth. "Mr. Phelps, I presume," said Holmes. The butler bowed slightly. "At your service, sir." "You keep the household keys?" "By Sir Felix's order, yes." "And the key to her ladyship's boudoir?" "In my charge." Always returned to its hook each evening, Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Yet the door was locked from within, Mr. Phelps. How do you reconcile that with your responsibility?" The butler's expression did not flicker. "I cannot, sir, unless her ladyship locked it herself." I did not approach the room that night. Holmes studied him a moment, then smiled faintly, as though the exchange had amused rather than enlightened him. We passed on without further word, but I knew that Phelps's very composure had marked him in Holmes's book. That afternoon, Holmes insisted upon speaking with Wenton once more. The young man arrived at Baker Street in some agitation, his thin face sharpened by sleeplessness. He protested again that he had no thought of inheritance. His cousin had left him nothing. But Holmes listened with a patience that made Wenton stumble over his own words. "At what hour did you last see Lady Margaret alive?" Holmes asked. "Shortly before 8. I had brought her a note, an invitation she had received. She dismissed me with some irritation. She wished to be alone." "And the note? Who sent it?" Wenton frowned. I believe it was signed by Madame Vale, but I cannot swear it. I thought it odd, for she was expected the next evening, not that one." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "You delivered it yourself?" "Yes, the footman had given it me in the hall. I did not break the seal." When Wenton departed, Holmes stood long at the window, his fingers drumming the sill. "There is our thread, Watson." A note, perhaps genuine, perhaps forged, delivered by a kinsman but not penned under his eye. Who in this house might contrive to pass such a thing into his hand? The butler, the valet, the maid, each a channel. And within that note, perhaps, instructions to light the candle. We returned that evening to Dorrington House. Lestrade, though not enamoured of Holmes's methods, had at least the sense to let him have the field. The inspector's men kept guard at the exits while Holmes made his quiet circuit of the servants. I watched him speak with the valet, a sleek fellow named Carson, whose nervous smile betrayed little. Then with the chambermaid, a country girl who trembled as though the mere presence of Holmes could strip her secrets bare. Neither yielded fruit, but when he came again to the butler, I saw in his eyes that quick flare of certainty. Holmes asked, as before, whether Phelps had the keys. The butler gave the same answer, but this time Holmes interrupted. "You are exact, Mr. Phelps. Too exact. Yet when we examined the bolt yesterday, it bore the polish of a thread. That thread was drawn from without. I can imagine only 3 men in this house with the steadiness to perform it, myself, a locksmith, or you. Shall we try the experiment?" He drew from his pocket the remnant of the filament he had collected at our first visit and held it out. For the first time, Phelps's eyes moved, not with fear, but with calculation. "A parlour trick, sir," he said evenly. "One I have seen before." Holmes's smile was thin as a blade. "Precisely. And one you employed. Where is the second candle, Mr. Phelps?" The butler's lips parted, then closed again. He folded his hands upon the ledger, his knuckles whitening, but he did not speak. "Very well," said Holmes, and he turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, I recommend that this man be searched. You may find upon him either the candle itself or the means by which it was concealed." Lestrade, with visible relish, ordered the constable forward. In the pocket of Phelps's coat was discovered a hollow tube of brass, capped at both ends. When opened, it revealed, rolled within, the remains of another candle, precisely of the kind found in Lady Margaret's chamber. Even Lestrade looked staggered. "What say you to this, my man?" The butler's composure cracked at last. "I did not kill her," he cried, his voice hoarse. "I swear it. I meant only to recover what should never have been in her hands. She was deceived by those parasites. I wished to spare the household the scandal." Holmes regarded him with that terrible calm that no protest could ruffle. "And so you provided her with the very implement of deception. You who locked her in, you who bolted the door with a thread to ensure that no intrusion marred the scene. Whether you intended her death or not, Mr. Phelps, you contrived the stage upon which she met it." The butler's shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. He said nothing more as Lestrade's men took him in charge. Yet Holmes did not look satisfied. As we walked back into the night, he muttered half to himself. "Too neat, Watson. Too ready. Phelps is the hand, but not the mind. He fears scandal, not gain. Someone else gains by her death, and it is that gain which will resolve the riddle. Until I see the whole ledger, I shall not close the case." His words echoed in me as the fog closed around our cab, and I knew the drama was far from ended. By the time we reached Baker Street, the exhilaration of the nocturnal capture had ebbed from Holmes's manner, and that inward listening came over him again, as if he stood somewhere below decks, feeling for the engine's fault through the thrum of the ship. He flung his coat upon the settee, stood a moment with his fingers at his temples, then crossed to the fire and spoke without looking at me. "Phelps is a function, not a cause," he said. "He moves when wound and stops when the spring runs down. He fears disgrace as a man fears a creditor. He does not calculate profit like a banker. Latham has the engineer's hand, but even he insists he did not complete the circuit. Who then closed it? Who wrote the score they played? I ventured that Sir Felix's temper and convenience told against him, but Holmes shook his head impatiently. Convenience is not compulsion. We shall proceed upon what the hand can make, not upon what the heart might want. There remain 3 lines to be traced: the origin of the special tapers, the path by which the summons reached Lady Margaret, and the purse into which her obligations were falling by degrees. Once those 3 are joined, the picture will stand out as a stereoscope. He sent 2 telegrams, one to Lestrade, urging that Latham and Phelps be kept apart and separately questioned upon any dealings with candles beyond those already seized, the other to Wenton, requiring him to present himself at noon with any scrap of the invitation that had drawn Lady Margaret into solitude. Then after a scant breakfast we took a cab into Bloomsbury again, not to Dorrington House, but to the narrow street where Madame Vale held her rights. We had scarce alighted when the acrid breath of a recent fire met us. A knot of curious had gathered. A constable shouldered them back from the door. Smoke still crept like a guilty thing along the lintel. Within, we found Madame Vale in a condition of disordered magnificence, her hair unpinned, her rings and bracelets stacked upon the table in a glittering barricade against misfortune. She greeted us with a torrent. "An accident, Mr. Haygilt Holmes. A lamp overset in the small hours. Mr. Latham being in custody, I was left to my own safety. The spirits warned me, but in such agitations one cannot always—" Holmes walked past her without a syllable, took in the parlour's blackened corner, and went down upon one knee among the char. With a penknife he levered free from the half-burnt heap a rectangle of stiff paper, its corner saved by having lodged under the brass toe of a fire-screen. He blew upon it. A heading bloomed, blurred but legible: Price and Son, Candle Factors and Oilmen, Hatton Garden. Beneath, in a cramped clerk's hand, 6 spirit tapers, special composition. On the margin, pencilled in a different fist, a single letter, C. Holmes's eyes brightened for the first time that morning. "Who overset the lamp, Madame Vale?" he asked mildly, still crouched. I must have done so myself. The hour was late. My nerves—" "Your nerves chose their moment well," he said, rising. "The fire bit cleanest where the invoices lay. Fortunate that a brass foot stood where it did. Tell me, does the letter C signify your secretary?" She swallowed. "Mr. Latham arranged my supplies, and yet one of your customers required something beyond the usual mixture," Holmes went on, tapping the rescued slip. "A cavity at the base, a bevel more subtle, small refinements, madame, but eloquent to the practised eye. Latham ordered your theatre candles, someone else ordered instruments. Who was the C who dealt with Price and Son?" For a moment she stared at him with the obstinacy of panic. Then her gaze slid sideways toward the passage. "I do not know names," she muttered. "Persons send servants." "There was a gentleman's valet who came twice of late." Very exact in his words. "He complained of draught, demanded a tighter wax, a neater foot. He had a small green stone in his ring, and a way of folding his hands that showed ink under the nail." Her eyes came back to Holmes, hard now with a gambler's defiance. "There are many valets in London, Mr. Holmes. They are all C when they choose to be." Holmes looked not at her, but at the scorched writing. "Ink under the nail," he repeated, as if the phrase pleased him. "A hand that copies." We left her in her ruin and turned our cab toward Hatton Garden. Price and Son proved to be one of those dingy establishments which survive by honouring a trade as if it were a parish duty. Mr. Price himself, a narrow man with a nasal voice and that intangible polish which comes of having served houses more ancient than his own, received us behind a counter pitted by hot metal and dotted with drops of hardened wax. Holmes showed his card and the charred invoice. Mr. Price's reserve dissolved with gratifying speed. "Ah, yes, 6 of the spiritual sort," he said. "We have a demand for them among the fashionable, mostly mystic ladies and their operators. Your Madame Vale is a good customer, pays in cash, complains in metaphor." "And this marginal C?" Holmes asked. Mr. Price pursed his lips. "A second order in the same quarter. If you supply to the lady, you may supply to me," he said. "A person of the class that lives in livery. Quiet, low voice, no perfume. Unusual among that tribe, he required alterations of finish that argued the candles were to be seen close at hand and handled, and, this is peculiar, he insisted upon the little hollow at the base to hold a token," he said. I advised against it. He insisted we charged extra. "When did this person last call?" "Day before yesterday, late afternoon. He paid with a sovereign, took away 2 pieces in a brass case that I supplied for the purpose, and said something that struck me. 'I collect what others mislay,' he said. The sort of remark that is less odd in a pawn shop than in a chandlery. Mr. Price's eyes flickered with a tradesman's memory. He wore a plain silver ring with a green stone. Paste, I should think. He had an ink spot on the left forefinger that my old master would have rapped for. Holmes's glance met mine for a fraction. Carson the valet had shown us nervous neatness and a clerk's smile. If I had not seen ink beneath his nail, I had seen the habit that would put it there. Before I could shape the thought, a boy came pelting in with his cap in his hands, and a policeman at his heel. "Beg pardon, sir, Mr. Holmes, is it? Inspector says come quick to Holborn. Mr. Murch, the money-lender's place has been broken, his papers took." We found the lane in commotion, and Mr. Murch white with fury, his safe gaping like a black mouth in the dim office. The bolt of the inner door showed a fresh scrape as if a wire had worried it. A drawer lay empty save for 2 schedules and a ticket book with a torn stub. 10 years, Mr. Murch spluttered, and no such impudence. "My ledger, my bills, gone. The gentleman has called himself Mr. Latham. Oh, I'll have his ears for this if there's law in England." Holmes took up the ticket book and studied the remaining stubs. "This one," he said softly. "Pledged, £200 in Lady Margaret Dorrington's hand. Collateral, rubies. Witness, F. Dorrington." He touched the counter-signature with a finger. "Do you always require a husband's hand, Mr. Murch?" "When the lady is likely to deny her bargain at home," Murch snapped. "A gentleman's word steadies the paper, most times." "Most times," Holmes echoed. "You have a copy of the note she gave in respect of this sum?" I had. "It's gone. Along with a dozen others that would fetch a price if one had a mind to wash laundry in public. I keep duplicates at my rooms. By heaven, if they try." Holmes had crossed to the door-frame and was sniffing like a hound. "Camphor," he murmured. "And there, Watson, see the minute scratch upon the paint where a thread has been drawn? The same school, the same teacher. Our author tidies—" "What author?" raged Mr. Murch. "A thief and a blackguard is what I'll call him in court." "In court you may name him what you please," Holmes said absently. "Out of court I call him a mind that dislikes loose ends." We returned to Baker Street with the afternoon already surrendering to grey. There Holmes let himself fall into his chair and stared at the ceiling until I thought him asleep with eyes open. At last he spoke. "We have, but in outline, a play in 3 acts," he said. In the first, a practitioner of effects supplies heat and vapour to a lady lonely and excitable. In the second, a hand within the house arranges solitude and a theatrical impossibility. A bolt drawn, a window fast, a summons that allows of no witness. In the third, a valet, mark that, Watson, a valet, procures refined instruments with a cavity designed to carry paper, and afterwards, when death has dropped the curtain, he or his master's friend reaches out to erase that paper at its source. Who moves most freely between drawing-room and tradesman? Who folds a lord's secrets into a neat roll and puts them by with the shirts? A valet. Who among all men has a hand trained to copy a signature in the morning and trim a candle in the evening? A valet. You accuse Carson? I said. I accuse a function, Holmes returned. Give it what name you like, but we shall be exact. I want 2 proofs that Carson handled the special tapers and that he or one under his direction forged or fetched the counter-signature we saw. The green stone and the ink smear please me, but they are commas, not a full stop. As if in answer, the bell rang, and Wenton was shown up, pale and harassed, with a folded paper he had found at last in the pocket of a discarded waistcoat. It was a scrap only, the seal and a strip of the lower edge, but upon it, in a backward-sloping hand, thin as a lady's veil, were the words, "Burn the Channel alone." 8 o'clock. No witness. There was no signature, but the paper bore a watermark, a coronet over a D. Holmes held it to the lamplight and gave a short, satisfied laugh. Our candle's hiding-place had the same coronet upon the char in the grate, he said. The stationery of Dorrington House. Not Madame Vale's, not a tradesman's, a message that came not from the wide, wicked world, but from under the same roof. Who writes upon the house paper without compunction? A member of the family, or a servant accustomed to aping one, went on, sat heavily. Carson, he whispered. He brings the notes to the breakfast tray and sets Sir Felix's pens. He has access to everything. Has he also access to the moneylender's office? Holmes asked dryly. He has access to a gentleman who might sanction such a visit or fear the need. We will not outrun ourselves. You will oblige me, mister. Went on by taking a drive this evening to the Diogenes. Hand to my brother a line I shall write. In return, he will pull, without moving from his chair, 6 threads that would take me a week on foot. Meanwhile, Watson and I will make a small excursion. To where? I asked. To the servants' entrance of Dorrington House, he said, standing. The backstairs talk when the front door is deaf. And if Mr. Carson be as neat as I take him for, he will not have failed to keep the brass case in which he carried those tapers. A neat man keeps his tools until someone else finds them. We went by a roundabout route and came into the mews behind the house as the lamps were being lit. Holmes spoke to no one at first. He went straight to the scullery, nodded to the maid with a geniality that removed her fear as the sun lifts frost, and asked, in the tone of a man old in household ways, to be shown where the gentlemen's brushes were kept for cleaning. The brushes were kept in a narrow cupboard off the pantry. Beside them, upon an upper shelf, in that limbo where the male servant puts things that do not belong to the master and yet must be accounted for, lay a brass tube capped at both ends. Holmes took it down, weighed it in his hand, and unscrewed the cap. Within were crumbs of a pale aromatic substance, and a hair, silk, brown, caught in the thread of the cap. He lifted it out with his forceps and laid it along his cuff. Silk, of the same braid as the tie upon our little roll of paper, he said softly. And listen. From the passage came the measured step of a man who has trained his foot to announce confidence. Carson appeared in the doorway, very trim, very pale, and with ink, God bless Mr. Price's memory, plain under the nail of his left forefinger. He stopped dead when he saw the open tube in Holmes's hand. Something like admiration, bitter and involuntary, passed over his face. "You are thorough, sir," he said. Holmes smiled, not pleasantly. "It is a vice that has brought me indifferent sleep and fair success. You will oblige me, mister. Carson, by accompanying us to Scotland Yard, If your conscience is as tidy as your cupboard, you will find questions easy. Carson's eyes flicked once to the side, no more than the glance a swan gives a reed before taking water. Then he moved, not toward us, but back, swift as a cat, and the next instant the corridor echoed to running feet. Holmes was after him like an arrow. I followed with less efficiency and more noise. We burst into the area. A door banged. A dark shape shot across the mews and swung into the lane. At the corner, a hansom stood, its driver half asleep upon the perch. Carson sprang, the whip cracked, and the cab leapt like a startled deer. Holmes's fingers found my arm, and a second later we were in pursuit, our own driver lashing at the fog. For a minute we had the tailboard in sight, then a brewery dray lurched between, and the darkness swallowed our man as if London herself had been in the plot. Holmes sank back, breathing evenly, his eyes alight with the cold joy of the chase. "We have him in the hand, Watson," he said. "If not tonight, then tomorrow." He runs because he has something to run from, and when a neat man runs, he leaves behind him precisely what he most fears to have found. He touched the pocket where the brass tube rested. We shall see before dawn whether the author writes legibly. The fog had settled once more by the time we returned to Baker Street, though Holmes's mind was brighter than I had seen it in days. He set the brass tube upon the table as though it were a trophy, then drew out the silk hair with his forceps and laid it across a sheet of paper under the lamp. "You observe, Watson," he said, "the fiber's colour, brown with a faint sheen. It is no mere sewing thread. This is silk braid of the kind used in gentlemen's cravats. Carson, being neat to the point of vanity, would never cut away a fragment carelessly. He bound it about our roll of paper, meaning to fetch it back once the scene had served its purpose. In his flight, he has left us the very string that tied his fraud together." I bent closer. "It seems conclusive." Holmes's lips twitched in that familiar sardonic fashion. "Conclusive, yes, but only of agency, not of motive. The butler arranged the locked door, the secretary contrived the vapours, and the valet prepared the candles. Yet who commanded the orchestra? Carson is clever but not sovereign. He runs, therefore he fears. The question is, whom does he fear more, Scotland Yard or his own master?" He rose, restless as a hawk in tether, and paced the room. "Sir Felix has played a strange game, aloof at the Diogenes, curt in his letters, but betraying a flicker of dread at the sight of a candle. He gains his freedom by his wife's death, but no wealth. Indeed, her jewels were pawned. No fortune changes hands. But scandal, Watson, scandal can ruin a clubman faster than debt. If her debts and séances became known, his own reputation might founder. And who keeps reputation intact but a valet who tidies indiscretions into neat brass tubes? Before I could reply, the bell rang. Lestrade entered, stamping the fog from his boots with news written upon his face. "We've been after your Carson all evening," he said. "He doubled us twice, slipped a constable in Holborn and another near Charing Cross, but we've traced him to the river. A lighter man swears he took a fare aboard bound downstream. We'll have the wharves watched by dawn." Holmes listened with half an ear, then asked abruptly, "And Phelps?" "How bears the butler himself?" "In his cell, protesting he meant no harm. Says he feared for the family name, and sought only to keep her ladyship's follies from the servants' gossip. He swears he never touched the candles." Holmes gave a short laugh. "Then he lies." "But a lie born of obedience, not ambition. He shielded his master or his master's man. Still, Lestrade, see that he and Latham remain apart. They are pieces of the same puzzle, but the edges will not meet if they whisper together." When the inspector had gone, Holmes turned to me with sudden resolution. "Watson, we must confront Sir Felix, not at his club, where silence is his shield, but in his own house, where his walls may betray him." It is time the author of this play heard his own script read aloud. The following morning found us once more in Bloomsbury. Sir Felix received us in the library, a handsome room lined with calf-bound volumes which, by their dust, had not been disturbed in years. He stood before the hearth, his moustache waxed to perfection, his expression one of chilled disdain. "You persist, Mr. Holmes," he said. "First you drag my servants into scandal, now you presume to question me in my own library. I shall indulge you for 5 minutes, no more." Holmes ignored the dismissal and walked slowly along the shelves, his hand trailing idly across the bindings. "A fine collection, Sir Felix. I see volumes of Cicero, Gibbon, Burke, works on rhetoric, not philosophy. Fitting for a man whose life is measured in appearances. But appearances, as you must know by now, are treacherous things." Sir Felix stiffened. "Come to your point, sir." Holmes turned, his gaze piercing. "Very well. Lady Margaret received a note written on your own house stationery, instructing her to burn a special candle in solitude. That candle, procured through your valet, was prepared to conceal incriminating papers at its base. Your butler arranged the locked room illusion, your secretary contrived the intoxicating vapours, and you, Sir Felix, stood behind them all, ensuring that your wife's ruinous debts and dangerous amusements should end in silence." A flush crept up Sir Felix's neck. "You dare accuse me without proof?" Holmes drew the silk thread from his pocket and let it fall upon the desk. "Here is one proof. Your valet's careful braid, binding the pledge note your wife signed. And here," he held up the charred invoice from Madame Vale's parlour, "is another, marked with a C for Carson, who could not have acted without your sanction. No tradesman deals with a valet on such sums without the master's authority. The signature on the pawn ticket was yours, Sir Felix. You lent your hand to her ruin, then sought to erase it." For the first time, the man's composure cracked. His eyes darted toward the bell pull, then back to us. "She would have destroyed me," he hissed. "Do you know what it is to see one's name linked with charlatans and debtors? To watch a lifetime of respectability mocked in the papers? I did not kill her. I merely arranged that her follies should be contained. If she succumbed to her own imagination, am I to blame?" Holmes's voice was like ice. "You are to blame, Sir Felix, because you turned trickery into tragedy. You forged the summons, you commanded your servants to prepare the stage, and when the play ended in death, you sought to pluck the damning papers from the fire. Your valet has fled, but his flight is your confession. You are the author, and no silence of the Diogenes can hide it now." Sir Felix sank into his chair, his hands trembling on the arms. "What will you do?" he whispered. "That rests with Scotland Yard," Holmes replied. "I provide only the script. Lestrade supplies the curtain." We left him there, staring into the dead grate, a man who had prized reputation above conscience and lost both. As we walked back into the fog, I ventured, "Do you think the law will reach him, Holmes?" Men of his class have eluded justice before Holmes's mouth set in a grim line. "Perhaps. But society has a harsher tribunal than the courts, the whispers of a club, the glance of an acquaintance. Those will hound him more cruelly than the dock. Already the web tightens. Carson will be taken at the wharves, the servants will testify, the papers will speak. Whether the judge condemns him or not, his own circle will pass the severer sentence." I was silent, struck by the bleak justice of it, and as the cab bore us away I thought of Lady Margaret. Her life ended by the very contrivances that had been meant only to bind her indiscretions in secrecy. The candle that dripped without wax had burned out at last, leaving behind only smoke, ruin, and the indelible mark of a husband's fear. Holmes, seeing my expression, laid a hand briefly on my arm. "Do not grieve overmuch, Watson." She was a foolish woman, but she deserved better than a stage death contrived by cowards. If we have given her truth in place of silence, we have done her one service at least, and now—" his voice lightened, almost whimsically. "I believe I owe my violin a new string. The case is closed." Yet in his eyes, as we turned back into Baker Street, I saw not satisfaction, but the faint shadow of distaste, as if the web of deceit we had torn apart still clung to him, and the smell of that strange candle lingered longer than even the fog of London could absorb. The following days passed in a curious twilight of suspense, for although Holmes had declared the case effectively closed, the matter was far from settled in the eyes of the law. Carson remained at large, and the Yard, despite Lestrade's best efforts, had not yet laid hands on him. The newspapers, scenting scandal but denied the full particulars, printed vague allusions to a mysterious death in Bloomsbury, hinting at spiritualist influence and a certain aristocratic household under suspicion. Holmes read these accounts with a curl of his lip, but he was not so impervious as to ignore them. "Mark it well, Watson," he said one morning as he folded the Standard. "Here we see the very weapon that Sir Felix feared most, public opinion. It presses upon him more keenly than any cell of Newgate. Each half-sentence, each whisper, is another nail driven into the coffin of his reputation. And yet—" He paused, tapping the paper with a long finger. "I am not content. The matter of Carson unsettles me. He is too clever to vanish utterly. He will surface, and when he does, it will not be at random. His nature is to tidy, as I have told you, and something remains untidy still." I asked what he meant, but Holmes only smiled faintly and turned back to his chemicals, where he was once more examining the residue scraped from the special tapers. I had learned that when he grew cryptic in this way, he was often at his most certain, though unwilling to voice a conclusion until he could bind it with proof. 2 nights later, the storm broke. I had just retired when Holmes's sharp knock came at my door. He entered without waiting for reply, his eyes blazing with that electric fire I knew too well. "Come, Watson. Carson has been sighted. A constable traced him to a lodging-house in Lambeth. Lestrade has sent word. If we hurry, we may be present at the end of this business." Within the hour, we were rattling through the misty streets in a cab, Lestrade opposite us, his thin features taut with grim satisfaction. "He thought to lose himself among the riverside drabs," the inspector said, but a pawnbroker in Kennington recognized him and gave the alarm. "We've the house surrounded. He cannot escape us this time. We found the place a mean building at the edge of the wharves, its windows yellow squares against the darkness. Policemen loitered in the shadows, their breath clouding in the cold air. At a signal, Lestrade led us in. The stair creaked under our tread as we mounted to the top floor, where a door stood ajar, spilling a thin wedge of light. Inside sat Carson, immaculate as ever despite the squalor of his surroundings, his coat brushed, his hair in order, though his face was pale and his hands trembled ever so slightly upon the table before him. Upon that table lay the brass tube Holmes had discovered in the pantry, now empty, and beside it a neat packet of papers tied with ribbon. He looked up as we entered, and for a moment I thought I glimpsed relief in his expression rather than fear. "So," he said quietly, "it ends here." Holmes advanced, his gaze fixed upon the packet. "Not quite. You intended it should end with these, did you not? The remnants of Lady Margaret's obligations, perhaps? Or other papers that tell a less convenient truth?" Carson's lips curved in the faintest smile. "I kept them safe. Sir Felix bade me destroy them, but I am a servant, not a fool. Paper burns, but ink remains, sometimes in memory, sometimes in the hands of a careful man. I thought to bargain with them. If need arose, Lestrade snatched the packet and rifled through it with a triumphant air. Here we are, her promissory notes, the pawn tickets, and letters. Plenty to damn her and her husband alike. Very neat, my man. You'll find the cells less comfortable than your master's pantry." But Holmes did not share the inspector's triumph. He had taken up the empty brass tube, turning it slowly in his hands, his eyes half closed in thought. At length he said, "You fled not because you feared the gallows, but because you feared discovery of these. Yet you preserved them. Why, Carson? Whose secret weighs heaviest here, your master's or your own?" Carson's composure faltered at last. He drew a long breath, then leaned forward, his voice low but steady. It was Sir Felix. Always Sir Felix. He would not have her name dragged through the mud. He commanded the candles, he forged the note, he bade me see to the details. I obeyed, as a servant must. But when the thing ended in death, he cursed me, cast me off as though I alone bore the blame. I kept the papers to prove my hand was not the only one. I meant to place them where no denial could avail him. Lestrade barked a short laugh. A pretty tale to shift the noose from your neck. But Holmes raised his hand. Not so fast, Inspector. His words bear the cadence of truth. A servant may contrive, but he does not command. Carson's guilt is clear in the mechanics, but the intention, that lies higher. And intention, in the eyes of the law, is the greater crime. Carson looked at Holmes with something like gratitude. You see, sir, I never meant her harm, only to keep the house from ruin, but it was Sir Felix who wove it all. Lestrade, though visibly vexed, at last conceded. Very well. We shall hear it before the magistrate. Both the master and the servant will have their say. He gave the signal, and Carson was taken away between two constables, still trim and dignified, as though he walked not to prison but to some final, inevitable appointment. Back in Baker Street, as dawn crept pale through the curtains, Holmes lay stretched upon the settee, his hands clasped behind his head, his eyes distant. I poured him coffee and waited, for I knew the tide of his reflections would soon break into words. At last, Watson, he said slowly, we see the whole pattern. Latham prepared the tools, Phelps managed the illusion, Carson handled the instruments, but the mind that bound them was Sir Felix. He sought to protect his name by silencing his wife's folly, yet in so doing, he signed the warrant of her death. The irony is exquisite. He feared scandal, and now scandal will consume him more utterly than any folly of hers could have done. And Carson, I asked, what of him? He will bear his share, Holmes replied, but I think the court will see the line between a servant's obedience and a master's command. It is not Carson who stands to be broken, but Sir Felix. Society is harshest to its own when they stumble. I could not but agree, though my heart was heavy. I had seen too often how human pride and fear could weave a net more deadly than any deliberate malice. Lady Margaret had been vain, credulous, foolish perhaps, but she had not deserved so dreadful an end, nor had her death been truly wished by those who contrived it. It was born of secrecy, of cowardice, of a terror of ridicule, a terror stronger than honour. Holmes, perceiving my mood, gave a thin smile. Come, Watson, do not brood. The world is full of candles, but very few drip without wax. We have quenched this one, and with it a little folly. That is all that can be asked of us. And so the case passed into history, a tale the Yard would file among its curiosities, and the clubs would whisper about behind raised papers. For myself, I carried with me the memory of that smooth, unnatural taper, its blackened wick pointing upward like an accusing finger. And though Holmes returned with apparent ease to his violin and his monographs, I knew that somewhere within him the scent of clove and camphor lingered, a reminder that even the neatest contrivances can blaze into tragedy when touched by human fear. It was scarcely noon on the third day when the matter, so far as the law was concerned, came to its pivot. A note from Mycroft, delivered by a boy who looked as if the ink was still wet upon his fingers, lay upon our breakfast table like a summons. Holmes read it once, folded it twice, and gave a dry little nod that I had come to recognize as the click of a tumbler falling into place within his mind. The Diogenes has remembered more than most men think it sees, he remarked. Porters are the eyes of silence, Watson. Come, Lestrade will want his string drawn tight without a fray. We found the inspector in a condition of grim expectancy outside Dorrington House. Sir Felix has consented, under protest, to hear you in the library, he said. Carson is under guard at the yard. Latham and Phelps are committed for further examination. If you have a single card left to play, Mr. Holmes, now is the hour." Holmes smiled in that thin way which means he is about to cease being patient. In the library, the master of the house received us with a stiffness that might have been dignity had it not looked so like fear dressed in Sunday clothes. He stood by the hearth. Beyond him, the high windows admitted a pallid light that showed dust motes floating like reluctant truths. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Holmes," he said, as before. "I shall use 4, Holmes answered, and sat upon the edge of a table with the unassailable ease of a man who knows the ground. "We have, Sir Felix, the invoice from Price and Son for 6 special tapers, ordered by a person who identified himself with the letter C and paid in cash. We have Mr. Price's memory of a valet with a paste green stone and ink under his nail. We have, from your own pantry, the brass case in which 2 of those tapers were carried to this house." He drew the tube from his pocket and laid it, muffled, upon the cloth. "We have from the boudoir the candle with a cavity, and from that cavity the roll of paper bound with silk, which bears your signature beneath your wife's pledge to Mr. Murch. We have from your grate a charred scrap with your coronet's watermark, and from Mr. went on a torn seal of the same stock, bearing the instruction to light the channel alone. We have from Madame Vale the smell of clove and camphor, and an apparatus, which, in the hands of a timid audience, makes apparitions upon the nerves. We have from your butler the thread upon the bolt, from your secretary the bladder that breathed more spirits into the air, and from your valet the neatness that binds a scandal with ribbon and puts it on the shelf." Sir Felix's fingers tightened imperceptibly upon the mantle. "You recite a list of servants," he said. "It is a long step from their tricks to my guilt." "Tricks do not happen without a theatre," Holmes returned, "and theatres do not open their doors without a licence." He took from his breast the sheet that Mycroft had sent and held it as one might hold a warrant. "Here is the porter's book of the Diogenes for the day your wife died. It shows, as you would wish it to, that you entered at 6:30. It shows, as you told us, that you left after 10. What it also shows, because the porter's duty is to see what gentlemen condescend to forget, is that at 25 minutes past 7, a private hansom, hired for the day, called at the side entrance. A gentleman, muffled and with his hat brim pulled low, left the club by the stairs kept for such exits and returned by the same stairs at 9:40. The porter is a discreet man, but he is not blind, nor, when Mycroft Holmes inquires, is he mute. He observed, he could hardly fail to observe, that your overcoat bore the monogram F.D. upon the collar loop. The coachman, whom Lestrade has found, observed that his fare gave him Bloomsbury and back, and that he paid double to make no stop between. Sir Felix's lips moved, but produced no sound. For an instant I thought the man would brazen it out, but something in Holmes's level gaze took the starch from him. He made a small, involuntary gesture toward the chair behind him, and then thought better of sitting. "You mistake necessity for malice," he said at last, and the words came as if ground out between his teeth. "I meant to end a folly, not a life. She was destroying us both. I would not see my name dragged with hers through the mud-holes of the town." I took advice. Latham found what would impress her. Phelps knew how to secure a door. Carson, damn him, loved order too well. I left the club to prevent exposure, to make certain the scene remained containable. I did not reckon that she would. He broke off with a clench of the jaw that was not grief. "Call it cowardice, if you please." "It was survival. Call it manslaughter, if the magistrate pleases," Lestrade said dryly. But Holmes lifted a hand, and the inspector, to his credit, held his tongue. "Your intention," Holmes said very coolly, "is a fabric your counsel may weave as he can." "I have no gift in such tailoring. I deal in threads, and mine are sufficient. There is one last strand, and it is the only one that matters to me." He turned his head slightly. "Watson, You will remember the minute bubble of residue near the rug. I did. Brittle, aromatic, clove, and a sharper spirit, I said. Just so. The sharper spirit was not camphor. He drew from his pocket a little glass phial and held it under his nose with evident distaste. It was a trace of nitrite, enough to dilate vessels and quicken the heart, harmless to a healthy subject in air, dangerous, fatally so, to a lady habitually overwrought, alone in a small room, terrified and breathing shallowly. Latham was right when he said he did not intend death. He had always used a dram too little to harm and enough to amaze. You, Sir Felix, altered the measure. The batch that Price supplied at your valet's insistence has a higher proportion. I have proved it upon my bench, and Mr. Price's ledger shows when the formula was changed. It was changed after your C called a second time, and the notation in the margin, closer composition, tighter foot, leave hollow, is in a hand that copies a good deal. Carson's hand. He did not compose your wife's end, but he strengthened the mixture at a master's request. The light seemed to go out of Sir Felix's face. He stared at Holmes with a fascinated horror, like a man seeing a portrait speak. "You cannot know," he began, and then with a bitter laugh, "But you do know. You know everything. Take your triumph, Mr. Holmes. You are very clever." Holmes's expression did not change. When he spoke, it was with no triumph at all. "Cleverness is of no comfort here. I would rather your wife had wept and scolded for 20 years than that I should read to you this morning. The law will determine your degree of guilt. My business is concluded." Lestrade stepped forward with that official economy of movement which tells that the gloves are now off and the docket open. Sir Felix did not resist. He rang for his butler, then, abruptly recalling, gave a twisted smile that for the first time made him appear pitiable rather than offensive, and allowed himself to be taken without further speech. In the street the wind had shifted and the fog with it. There was a sharper tang in the air, as if the town too had turned a page. Went on, who had waited, pale and faithful, upon the pavement, caught my sleeve. "Is it over?" he asked, as men ask after operations. "For the police," I said, "it begins. For the rest of us, it ends." Holmes did not speak until we were once more in the familiar armchairs of Baker Street. Then he stretched his long limbs, steepled his fingers, and looked into the fire with that lean profile which in certain lights puts one in mind of an eagle at rest. "You will observe, Watson," he said, "that each misdirection in this case had attached to it a grain of truth, like a weight, to make it fall plausibly. The candle burned hotter than common. True. The door was bolted from within. True. The husband sat in a club where no man speaks. True. And yet in each the truth was balanced on a trick. Oils in the wax, a thread upon a bolt, a stare for exits that do not appear in the first column of a porter's book. I begin to weary of these contrivances in which fear of laughter proves a stronger motive than love or greed. They are the hardest to uproot. They run along the hedgerows of respectability and hide under the leaves. "And Madame Vale?" I asked. "What becomes of her theatre?" "Her trade will suffer," he returned, with a shrug that carried contempt without heat. "Lestrade has charged her with fraud. She will protest that she sells comfort, not lies, and half her clients will believe her. Latham will face the court upon his part in the contrivances and upon his burglary. He will not hang, and he will not prosper. Phelps will live out his days in a lodging-house where the bell does not ring for him. It is a subtler sentence than prison for such a man. As for Carson, he will turn King's evidence and save his neck by his tongue, and then he will discover that London remembers a face more faithfully than it forgives a service. He will go to sea or to the colonies. His neatness will find work where names do not matter." "You are very certain," I said. "I am very used," he answered, "to how the world tidies away its discomforts." He was silent a moment, then added, not unkindly, "Do not make me into the world's conscience, my dear fellow. I prefer the violin." He took it up then, and, after the first tentative stroke, let the bow travel into a grave line that ran like a seam through the room's quiet. I sat and watched the smoke go up and thought of Lady Margaret's face as Wenton had described it, the terror fixed there, and of the candle with its blackened wick and smooth-lying sides. The fog lifted toward evening, and the city, washed a little by a spatter of rain, showed clean edges to its roofs and chimneys. When at last Holmes laid down the violin, he glanced at the mantel clock and allowed himself one of those aphorisms which are his nearest approach to philosophy. "Beware the man," he said, "who fears ridicule more than he loves truth. He will light any candle and call its smoke the spirit of wisdom. It is our business, Watson, to open a window." A week later the committal was held. I shall not set down the tedium of affidavits and exhibits, nor the sour relish with which certain journals made a banquet of what had once been a marriage. Sir Felix was sent for trial upon a charge which the law books will term with a colder phrase than murder. The rest fell as Holmes had predicted. We were walking, on the day the grand jury found a true bill, past a shop window where candles stood arrayed like soldiers, when Holmes paused, his eye on a single pale taper. "Harmless," he murmured, and then, seeing my glance, smiled with a hint of the old mischief. "Do not start whenever you see a wax stick, Watson." "It is a poor way to live. It is better," I returned, "than living without the man who taught me to look at them closely." He laughed then, and the cloud that had haunted him since Bloomsbury thinned and drifted off. We went home to Baker Street with the evening brightening over the roofs. And if there was still in some corner of that room the faintest ghost of clove and camphor, it yielded, as all such ghosts must, to fresh air and time. The trial itself, though lacking in outward drama, supplied all the confirmation Holmes had foreseen. Carson, confronted with the brass tube and the testimony of Price and Son, yielded his silence for a bargain. He laid bare every instruction received, every errand run, and in each the shadow of Sir Felix stood over him. Latham, for his part, attempted clever evasions, but the burglary of Murch's office sealed his fate. Phelps clung stubbornly to the plea that he had acted to preserve the household's dignity. The magistrate, less tolerant than a gentleman's club, saw in his action only complicity. Madame Vale was fined and stripped of her premises, her circles dispersed like smoke from the very candles that had undone her reputation. Sir Felix himself heard his sentence with that rigid disdain which had always been his shield. The court found him guilty of culpable homicide, a term less terrible than murder, yet enough to end his career and exile him from the society whose opinion he had prized above honour. He was consigned to a term of imprisonment that would outlast his good name. Holmes, who had testified with precision and restraint, spoke not a word of triumph after the verdict. When I asked if he was satisfied, he answered only, "Justice is a rough tailor, Watson. The cut is seldom elegant, but it covers what must be covered." When all was concluded, Wenton came to Baker Street to thank Holmes with a sincerity that moved me deeply. His loyalty to his cousin's memory had been cruelly tested, yet he declared that Holmes had given Lady Margaret a kind of vindication, that she had been more the victim of fear and manipulation than of vice. Holmes accepted his gratitude with characteristic brevity, then turned the conversation to the weather, as if even kindness embarrassed him. In the weeks that followed, London moved on to fresh scandals, and the candle that dripped without wax became a tale whispered only in quiet corners. Yet I could not shake from my mind the image of that smooth, unnatural taper, its flame fed not by wax, but by deceit and fear. To me it seemed emblematic of the case itself, a light that burned without substance, consuming those who trusted in it. One evening, as we sat together in our old chairs, the fire crackling and Holmes absently drawing his bow across the violin, I ventured to ask what lesson he drew from it all. He paused a moment, the bow poised, then said, "Only this, Watson, when men dread ridicule more than wrongdoing, they will contrive horrors to preserve appearances. Such candles do not drip wax, but they leave stains all the same. Our task is not merely to quench them, but to show the world that their light was false." He resumed his playing, and the melancholy notes filled the room with a gentler illumination than any taper could provide. I leaned back, content that once again Holmes's relentless logic had brought truth from shadow, and that even amid the fog of London his brilliance shone like a steady flame that could not be extinguished. And so ended the strange affair of the candle that dripped without wax, one more chapter in the annals of Sherlock Holmes, where folly and fear met their reckoning, and where reason once more prevailed.